Hello, this is Property Matters, a weekly catch-up on the world of property, supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and auctionproperty.co.uk. And we're live every week on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn and our website, propertymatterstv.co.uk. If you're watching on the website, can you leave us a Google review? That would be great. And if you're watching via social media, get involved in the conversation in the comments section. Our email address for topics is hello@propertymatterstv.co.uk. There's a podcast version of the show every week as well. You can get that from Monday at 10 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts from. So let's take a look at this week's property news. Very much in the news with the King's speech and so on. It's Joe Joshi.
Good morning, Paul, and good morning to everybody that's out there. Yes, lots to say in the King's speech, and I'm sure that you're going to have lots of questions for me in that as well, Paul.
Yeah, we're judging the industry reaction to the speech this week. Of course, the King made the speech. King Charles gave the speech, as is tradition, on the government's decision to put housing, at least, at the centre of the focus of this year's this next Parliament. And there's a big task ahead, they say. No surprise there. At the opening of the Parliament, King Charles revealed the government's plans to get Britain building and reform the planning system to deliver more housing. It was not surprising to see house building playing a central part in the speech, as successive governments had limited success in the past in housing delivery targets. There is a big question that remains, however, and that is whether changes to the planning system will be enough to resolve this. With any growth in supply, of course, there is a potential for greater pressure on the already complex house buying process, which is not currently really fit for purpose in the sense that people are spending 5-6 months moving house. And if we do start building in greater numbers, it's important that we continue to play our part to transform the home buying experience, professionals are saying, providing lenders and borrowers with all the necessary tools and innovations to support faster decision making and access to wider product choice to make the whole process as seamless for everyone involved. And that's a point. It's a good point, isn't it? Because it's all very well building houses. It's not just about the numbers, is it, Joe? Because if you haven't got the infrastructure literally in the planning in the local councils, if you haven't got the infrastructure within the legal system, and you've got this this problem with planning, it really it won't make it any better, will it? It won't speed things up for a start.
No, I mean it's really a case of what comes first in this situation, and yes, it is important and imperative that more properties, more housing is built for the shortfall that has been consecutive with every government that seems to come through. They've all had targets of 300,000 homes, and none of them have actually managed to achieve that, and yet they've put that back on the agenda now. In the King's speech, and as one of their pledges coming into government by the Labour Party. Now, the question is, so the first thing is it's very good news. I'm very happy to hear that they're going to do something about it, which they've all talked about and not got around to doing. But to get there, they've also got a lot of other things that they need to deal with. And of course, one of the first things is the infrastructure, as you rightly point out, in how to get the planning and get the properties agreed in those given areas that they want to develop. They've talked about new towns. They've talked about grey belt, a new version of between green and brown belt. They've talked about obviously the time that it takes for a planning application to go through, and that is probably almost where it could start and finish, because if they don't get the planning applications through in a given time, then of course the rest of it will just all fall by the wayside. They're not going to get, building controls. They're not going to get the site. They're not going to get materials, and it just goes on and on and on and on. And subsequently, the question would be that did he get it right? So yes, of course, it's very important for them to get the infrastructure right, like the planning officers, the planning team, and the kind of authority those planning officers can and cannot have within their own system, even to the point that they want to sort of allow the committee. So if certain planning applications in a council will go to a committee, they want to even revise the rules of the committee so that the committee has perhaps a little bit more authority in order to be able to give or grant a certain planning application that may require before it goes to appeal. So there's a whole process that has to be dealt with. I'm not really sure that that is going to happen in a short space of time. I've been speaking to the planning offices sort of locally and find that at the moment, especially since COVID, a lot of the consultants, the planning consultants that they employed went remote and decided not to really come back in. So they come in and add value to the council few days a week. And there's probably, half a dozen, if you're lucky, of those, normally 2 or 3 or 4 of them. And they're trying to deal with all the applications that are coming in. And those applications are varied, Paul, that they have to do. It's not all about development. They could be as boring as making sure that a particular sign is in the right place, and they have to have planning permission granted to have that sign on a building that is already in existence, and someone has to make an application, and those planners have got to make those decisions about whether the sign is in the right place. And then further down the line, they've got to make a decision whether the development, so there's one extreme to the other. There's a boring side of the planning application which talks about how the look should be of a building, and whether the size or the length or the breadth of a particular signage on the shop or on the office or wherever it is going to be is the right size and meets all the criteria. To the other side, when you've got an entire estate being built and the infrastructure of the roads, all the layout of the utilities, gas, electric, etc. So many components, so many people that are involved in that. And I'm not really sure that that can be speeded up, because it's only as fast as the guy in front, and it's only as slow as the guy behind. It's all relative to making sure that they can actually do this as a teamwork. And because they are so sparse and spread out nowadays, they're not in the one place like they used to be, or on another floor in the same building. They are now from home or a different part of the country, a different place. And so that is going to take quite a bit to try and get that, brought in order to start considering the time frame. And that's where the problem becomes, is the time frame. And that's been the biggest issue with all developers. An application normally says 8 to 10 weeks, and if they don't reach their target in that, the easiest thing for them to do is to say, well, we refuse it, so that it gives them time to go back in. An applicant, in the meantime, the person that is putting the application is now spending another bunch of money, and on top of that, they're also spending another 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 weeks, whatever the process might be, for a renewed application. There was a time when you used to be able to get a verbal view. That's gone. There used to be a time when you used to be able to put an outline application. That is gone. So even the basics of application are pretty much like a full application. Drawings have to be almost to the point to show them that this is what the end product is going to be looking like. So I think the idea is fantastic. I'm really happy to see that they've chosen that the housing or the property market is the market that they need to start as they need to go on. But yes, there's a lot of work to be done.
I've never understood that point, Joe, that they make, and you're right, they do make it regularly, which is, will people now work remotely? I don't understand why that means the process has to be slower, because at the end of the day, if they're doing their job properly, they'll be on a screen, and if somebody sends you a message via Teams, then you get that message instantly and you can respond, just like you would have done if you were in the same building. I really don't understand why suddenly everything has to go at half pace just because people are remote. It only seems to be in those government or municipal departments that sort of thing seems to go on. But that aside, if I was a finance director for a local council and I had to make decisions, or our councillors had to make decisions on whether to provide services to vulnerable and elderly and so on, or whether I could make people with lots of money sit and wait for another 4 or 5 weeks for their planning decision because we'd rather not replace the people who went part-time or the people who left during COVID. It's all too easy to say, well, they'll be the people that take the hit for our budget cuts. And then that goes back to the fact that councils haven't been properly resourced for years.
That's right. I mean, a majority of the councils are almost but bankrupt. We know that a number of councils that are nearing where I am out, they've been bankrupt. There's loads more that are on the verge of virtually being bankrupt because they haven't been resourced, or if they have been resourced, they've abused those funds in a way that has now put them in such a bad position. People bought, lots of bad decisions were made in those things, and subsequently, that's where it's also, it rolls down. It's a snowball effect, and the next people are obviously the people. Then it's down to the planning officers, the people that they're working, and the whole team starts to unravel. I mean, in some cases, people have had to sell lots of assets in a town in order to try and shore up the deficits. But the reality is that mistakes were made, and we're still paying the price. And I feel that we'll probably continue paying the price for a lot longer, even though that for the first time a government has come in and said, right, we're gonna do something about this planning issue. Now, the one thing that you have to remember, and we've always said this, and I certainly said it on our program, is that housing starts driving everything else, and that's why they got to build themselves out. In any situation, when you have a crisis in the country, you've got to build yourself out. It happened during the wars, and it happened several times before. In fact, during the pandemic, Boris had made sure that they were building, building, building. And as we know, we reported many times, many days, many weeks, that the race for space, it meant so many people were still out there buying. So it can be done, and it does cause the right waves, the right noise in terms of what has to be achieved. But as you rightly point out, the infrastructure is so poor that, and even I agree with you, even though we say that, why do they have to be so slow even if they're working from home? But it gives them that choice. And you know how it is, Paul. The people that are working from home, I'm not having to go at anyone in particular, that opportunity gives them time to perhaps do other things in they're not focused. So when you are actually employed and you are in your work, there is a reason for you to do the job. But if you're working at home, there's nobody actually monitoring it. So we have to rely upon the integrity of that person that's doing it, that they're actually devoted to doing that job, as they are. But they might be. I mean, I know of people that actually move the mouse around on their laptop and have probably gone to some sort of gym or something else, as they go along. So people have said that to us, so we know that things like that happen, and that doesn't help the process. You
Well, that was
smile.
very diplomatic of you, I must say.
Well, I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some talk about the fact that also mentioned was this new digital information and smart data bill, which was included in the announcements, and it's basically they're hoping that that will allow much more of the whole conveyancing process, which we've discussed ad infinitum on this show, about how that we could actually get some kind of digital platform where all of the documentation for a property is easily available to those that need it when they need it, so they can just vastly move from a paper system through to this fairly digital system. So, I mean, that would be a big win in itself. And if they could bring down, I think we were talking, weren't they, in terms of 5 or 6 weeks, if I remember rightly, from an article we featured a few weeks ago, rather than 5 or 6 months. I mean, that would make a tremendous difference to the speeding up of the transactional purchasing of property and selling of property. Obviously, that's one side of it. Let's move on to the NIMBYism. Then that's a real brave one for Labour, because if they sit there saying, right, you lot can shut up, all the NIMBYs, of which we all are, if we're honest, at some point in our life. But the truth of the matter is that in 5 years there'll be another vote, and if you've had something built at the bottom of your garden, guess who you're not going to vote for next time?
Yeah, but you know what? It's probably that will, as you rightly say, we all are in some ways. And if we continued with that version of being an NIMBY, then you're not going to, we're not going to progress. And that happens everywhere, Paul. We've covered those in our stories, and I've known for situations where, I don't want something built at the back of my yard, but it's okay to build it in someone else's yard if you like, but as long as it's not behind me. And so, that will continue to persist. But if that's the case, then it's never going to happen. So, but there are areas, there are new town spaces, there are vast pieces of land that are perhaps not used correctly. And there you would probably prefer to see a new development of some sort rather than the eyesore of what is there perhaps in the current situation. So, it's not always about what's in your backyard. It could be also what's around your area that could be developed in a more suitable way. I mean, we know that in the areas that I'm at the moment, at the moment they just seem to be putting lots and lots of data centers, for example. I mean, nothing is more boring and exciting than a box being constructed of steel and with some sort of facade with lots of data inside it and lots of machinery. So it's not particularly exciting, but you look around and you think, well, okay, that's that's the future. So all of a sudden, the character buildings or whatever they built in between that were half decent are now going to be knocked down, and now a big square is going to be put up, and in there is going to be a data center because that's what the demand is for. There's a supply and demand, but in housing, people still want the character. They still want an area that they want to live in and a nice area, and they don't want to live on something that's been filled up with rubbish for the last 20, 30 years and has some sort of gases still coming out. So there's lots of things that has to be taken into consideration before some element of planning is granted. But I think the NIMBYs will continue. But there is going to come a time when, even if they do upset them and they don't get voted back in 5 years' time, the reality is that if they can reach their target of 1.5 million properties, it would certainly give homes to those that are homeless, and give the opportunity to first-time buyers and all those that wish to get on the property ladder.
The thing I find surprising is the amount of people who are allowed to sell off their gardens and then have roads or cul-de-sacs put up the side of their property so that they can then see some flats at the bottom of their garden as they're getting towards their retirement, and they think, well, I'll just make a few bob off the bottom of my garden. So much of that seems to be going on around the country.
Yes, and it will continue. It's been going on for years, Paul. And yes, it is a bit of an eyesore, but given the circumstances that those are and the opportunities, most people will take those opportunities. There's probably a small percentage that will argue about it, but a large percentage will say, well, okay, if I don't do it, somebody else will, and if they do it, then I don't get the benefit. So you can stand there for the morality. Morally, I don't want this to happen, but financially, it's not going to be a gain. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, at the end of the day, financially wins, because that's what makes the world go round. So people look at it and go, okay, well, if I could put a block of flats at the bottom of my garden and I can earn X, Y, Z out of it, then that's what they're going to do. Look, we're an island. We're not very big. And I think it's been managed fairly well throughout the decades on the basis that, not a large percentage of it is built. I think there's lots of scope. I see it as I drive around the country in my job, that there are things and sites that could have been, dealt with much, much better. You don't actually have to encroach on lots of new areas. There is enough to be recycled. There's enough properties that have been sitting dormant and derelict for years. And I think, councils should have the right, or be given the right, to knock on the door and say, look, if this isn't shaped up and turned back into a residential in a given period, then we'll end up having to do it, take it over, and you'll get what you're going to be given. There's so much of that. When I drive around the country, I see things boarded up, look tatty, look horrible, and I know that, they could utilize those a lot more effectively. We don't then need to talk to people that are saying, oh, can't build this in my backyard, because we shouldn't have to go to their backyard. There's enough around. But property is one of those things that it's like my ownership, and I'll do with it what I please. But that's maybe where planning laws, some infrastructure could be brought in. And when people are sort of sitting there, I mean, I was at a property recently, I went just near Gatwick, and there lies just a derelict building. It's boarded up, it's half falling down. It's in a lovely, lovely location, and it's just the only eyesore that is there. Nothing stopping someone saying, well, actually, there could be another 6 flats in there. We could do that. But it's just sitting there doing nothing. And you can see it's not done anything for a while because it's now just falling to bits. So I think there's a recycling that can happen without having to encroach on new, and new should be the last resort. And they brought this grey belt in, which is nothing but going to cause trouble, because I already have had conversation with people where they were thinking about moving and now saying, well, actually, there's this chance that we might have a bit of grey belt, so we'll hang on and see what the government is going to allow to do, where we might be able to put, 5 houses at the bottom of it.
It's interesting what traditionalists would probably turn around to you and say exactly the point you made a moment ago. You know, you go around the country and largely, I mean, there are some notable places, particularly most of the things built in the 60s and 70s that we'd rather not have happened. But generally speaking, when you look at our country and the way it's been developed, and you look at, say, America, and you make a comparison about what the planning system has done, the traditionalists would say, well, we haven't done too bad so far, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
And that's what I'm saying. It's not the case of broke and fix it. What I'm saying is that there is enough areas that you could deal with first before you need to go and start to fix something. There are areas that are poor, and they could be recycled. There are sites and properties that occupy huge chunks of land and actually probably don't need to occupy that much land, where they can, buy those properties in and restructure those areas rather than having to encroach on new areas. But whilst those things are great and they're good ideas and people like me come up with them, unfortunately, there's a system, and that's where it actually gets broken. In that system, you have all these people that say this can and this can't, this would and this that. And most of it is nothing to do with planning. It's about a matter of opinion. It's their opinion at that time, whether that should work or shouldn't work. They're never going to live there. But other people look at it and say, well, actually, that gives me an opportunity. I want to buy. I want to get on the property ladder. This is a great location for me. I'd like to buy that something that is built there. Because the minute these developments are put in, especially with the right infrastructure, they do sell. They sell off plan. They sell quite well because it gives people that newness. It's like, it's like new cars, Paul. There's always going to be a number of people every year without fail that just buy a new car. They just don't buy a second-hand car. And if that wasn't the case, if that didn't exist, new cars will just never sell. So there's always an element of people that say, I want a new home. I want to live in that location. But if they do the right things, put the right infrastructure, create the right product, they will sell. It's as simple as that. And everybody wants to get on the property ladder.
Do you think they missed an opportunity with stamp duty? There was a lot of talk before the election about maybe having something special for downsizers, for example. And I don't think they've even confirmed that the stamp duty levels are going to remain the same next year, are they?
The stamp duty are going to revert back,
Yeah.
I think, to the ones that are prior to the pandemic, and the reduction in the first time buyers. I would have thought they should have expanded on that and stayed with that for time being. Stamp duty will be a yo-yo that will be used by the Treasury and by the Labour to try and get more money back in. Labour will be known for the bigger taxes, and they're not going to actually turn around and reduce those taxes. They will bring it back up. So stamp duty, as we know from calculations and figures we've seen, brings in a good amount of revenue for the Treasury year in, year out. So they're probably looking forward for it to sort of be realigned with what it was before. So that would happen. But if there is enough housing being built and enough people interested in buying, enough incentives being created by lenders or by the government for first-time buyers to buy those, then stamp duty becomes secondary, but at the same time important for the Treasury, because obviously that means that they're going to get some more money coming into the system. No, they haven't done anything with the stamp duty. They've played it down at this moment in time, and they're playing up the housing market or the building or the construction of it. But the reality is that that's a long, drawn-out process. It's good headline grabbing, but when it comes to the reality, I think we'll be at least 2-3 years in before we start to see any real effect of what this is going to be. But what it is going to do is going to put a lot of people on standby on the hope and the prayer that their property falls into whatever this new category is going to be, and that they will do it. But each infrastructure is still taking too long. It's minimum 6-7 months. They want to have a pre-app on everything that they want you to do. The pre-application alone is 3 or 4 weeks before you actually get a look in to say yes, potentially, if but maybe and only in this and that we could actually consider this. In other words, they don't give you an answer. They just say you've got to put a pre-application in, which back some years you used to be able to pick up the phone to a planning officer and say, look, I'm thinking about this. What are your thoughts? And he'll say, well, look, if you did this, if you did that, we might consider it. Now, what they say is you've got to put in an application, a pre-app, pay a fee, and then we'll look at it. And that's this again. It's just slowing the process.
The whole downsizing thing would have been a great early win, I think, really, because as soon as you start to free up the larger homes, everyone moves up the ladder and that frees the ones at the bottom. The trouble is, of course, without the stamp duty, without taking off the punishment of stamp duty on downsizers, it does seem unfair to them to have to do that. Plus the fact when you add in the fact that all the bungalows, or not all the bungalows, but many bungalows have been converted into flats and another level put on top so that they can do that in certain areas, then, and I heard on the news this week on the night of the King's speech that people were saying it's not so much about we want little boxes to live in. We want the right type of homes. It's not just 1.5 million homes. We want the right type of homes. We want family homes. We don't want boxes when we're in our 50s. We don't want one-bedroom flats in our 50s. They're no use to us and no one's going to buy them. So and somebody actually said, why don't we build more bungalows? We've been converting them all into flats.
Well, first and foremost, let me talk about the downsizers. This downsizers is purely a myth. Those that have managed to get to their nice properties do not have a desire or a wish to want to downsize. The only time that they are forced to downsize is when it becomes completely impossible to care for them and they are in a remote location and it means that they've got to be moved perhaps into a home or some other structure has to be. Nobody I've met says to me, you know what, if they sort the stamp duty out, I'm going to move from my 1.5 million pound house to a 299,000 pound house because the stamp duty has really given me that impetus, that drive to reduce the size of my home and go into a box. And it's not going to do it. And that's just a myth as far as I'm concerned. But yes, they are sitting on some larger properties. And I think the way probably to consider people like that is to, have them as part of that. But part of the reason they went to those large properties, Paul, is because that's what Target does about life. And England is based that. You start with a studio, you start with, well, actually, let's say you start with renting a room, then you go to a studio, then to a one bedroom, then to a two bedroom, then you go to an end of terrace, then you go to a terrace, and so forth and so forth. That's the process, because that's how the housing market is built. You climb the ladder as you go along. So when you get to the top, it's like snakes and ladders. You actually don't want to be bitten by the snake and then go all the way down to the bottom. You want to avoid that, don't you? You always want to avoid getting on the snake to go back to zero. So they're not going to actually get to the top and then go, actually, you know what? Because the stamp duty is achievable, I'll go back to zero. It's not going to happen. But the redevelopment of perhaps their property and keeping that environment and working with those in there is probably a much more clever solution where you can say, well, look, you've got a big, large mansion property. It, can be converted or it can be taken down, and there could be some nice luxury block of flats, which gives another 10 people homes as well. And you can be part of that as well, and you can still enjoy your garden. Those are the things that people go for. That's why they want a big house. They want to enjoy the garden. They want the freedom, and they don't want to go to that box amongst an estate and then feel that now they're hemmed in. So, I'm not really sure that the stamp duty for people downsizing is a massive give. I think it's more headline grabbing than it is reality. The stamp duty for the first time buyers, I think, is a massive give because it gives them a chance to get their first run on the ladder to buying a home and excelling up the system.
A lot of property professionals saying that the war on NIMBYs, so-called, sounds like a good soundbite, but there was very little clarity in the speech as to how that was going to happen. And there was also another little elephant in the room, really, with that, because if you then have a war on NIMBYs, that suggests that developers have greater freedom to do what they want to do. Are we in danger of letting the developers have too much power over neighbourhoods, perhaps?
I don't think the developers will get too much power. They're still going to be governed and driven by what the planning status is going to be in what they're going to allow. So I don't think that'll be a huge thing. What it does allow them to do is probably approach more sites and look at things a bit more objectively. But the process itself has to be smartened and tightened up in order to get the speed of the process done. And that, I think, is going to be a long challenge, especially when majority of the people are struggling to get town planners or people that have got the qualifications to come in and help them achieve the goals that they want to achieve. So I don't think the developers are going to be rubbing their hand in glee and say, you know what, happy days, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I think what it does do is say, you know, this is good. We've got some sites that we've been sitting on, and we might be able to maximize the best we can out of those, given that this is the target that the government wants to do.
You mentioned the grey belt, so-called. It's pointed out that in the speech there was no definition of what, where or how much of this exists even. And when you think that there's too much power at local council level at the moment in planning, which simply doesn't have the specialist skills either, because of what we mentioned right at the start, needing to be effective, until the government delivers on its promises, many builders will be hampered in planning loops, making them unable to deliver on their commitment to build the new houses. This needs to be top of the agenda for the new government to get property investment moving and deliver the housing stock the UK needs, they say. Buying and developing property is a big undertaking for many, and this will only happen if the underlying economy provides the confidence needed for this kind of long-term planning. Matthew Tucker, who's a senior lawyer at Burgess Salmon, said the proposal to reform compulsory purchase order, or CPO, rules to make sure compensation paid was fair and not excessive had the ability to improve the financial viability of larger projects. He said it could make it easier for local authorities or other acquiring authorities to bring forward comprehensive planning proposals. There's an inherent tension, he says, between the centralisation and imposition of top-down targets, so the government's commitment would fund local authority capacity, and that would be critically important. So it's interesting, isn't it, that again, lots of sound bites. You know, the UK's grey belt. Well, we don't even know what that is yet. So there's one thing about it. Matthew Pennycook, the new housing minister, is going to have a very long and full in tray, isn't he?
Oh yes, no, his in tray is going to be overflowing, and he's not going to be able to deal with that because obviously everybody will say, okay, this is the new thing. You know, what are we doing about it? But the grey belt is you know, they've created an area that really doesn't define itself, so that will get caught up in so much red tape that, you know, grey will never be grey. It's as simple as that. It will never come out, and it'll go back to being green belt. You know, Paul, I've always said, and I still say, I think that all of these new areas of development, grey belt, this, that, the other, are a wrong approach. I think there's enough within the existing system and within the existing councils' portfolios and properties that could potentially be CPO'd, where compulsory purchase orders can be done, where they can actually utilize that far more effectively, the land that they've already got far more effectively, than having to go out to the market and start saying, well, actually, we need to start doing this here, when actually over on the right hand side you've still got a plot of land that probably could do with revamping, and they should put their energies on those. There was a time when the previous government, you know, brought in the idea that basically if planning application wasn't instigated, you know, within the first 3 years, it used to be 5 years, then they brought it down to 3 years, that they would, you know, start to say, well, you lose your planning application, or we end up doing something with it. But actually, nobody did anything about it. I mean, you know, they stick a spade in the ground and go, well, I've started my planning application just before year 3, and then there it sits for the next 5-10 years doing nothing again. So, you know, there's no real policing what is currently being done. And I think if they actually stopped and looked in their own cupboard, you'll probably find there's plenty there to do.
One thing that's positive from all of this, I suppose, Joe, is the fact that people, politicians in particular, are talking once again about property and the building of properties in this country. One thing that hasn't changed is we've still got lots of sound bites and hyperbole and not a lot of actual proposed plans, but we'll be keeping a close eye on this new government as the next 5 years unfolds, and certainly where property is concerned, we'll be keeping a close eye on how they develop. So that's Property Matters for this week. We'll see you again very soon.